I am going to talk about this issue that is often discussed in the media. So how can we reduce car use, and what drives the trends in car use, and what does it matter whether we have electrical bikes, all sorts of electrical cars that we had in the news just yesterday. So we're living in the world, I thought I could do this, where we have this long trend. We have two trends I'm going to talk about. One is this one. This is number of kilometers traveled per person. And this is the past 200 years, but you could sort of draw this backwards. And there's nothing pointing to this trend is flattening out. We're traveling longer and longer per person. This is also freight transport. The modes obviously have varied. We started with waterways. Now it's more, most of it is car use, about 80%. Most of it is car use, but it's still there and it's not flattening out. It's increasing. And this is something we have to deal with and try to understand whether this is a good thing or a bad thing. Then we have this other trend, which is much of the other side of the same coin, a strong urbanization. And this trend is also very strong, and it's no sign that it's declining. This is the share of the world's population that is living in the cities. And you see in 2030, I think this is the forecast is that 60% of the world's population will live in the cities. So what is driving this trend, and is it a good thing? And I will argue that this is a good thing because they both point to our needs and the benefit for accessibility. We need to come together, we need to see each other, we come closer to each other, workers come closer to the employers, and people come close to the markets, and firms are coming closer together. So this is driving much of the welfare explosion that we've seen over these past 200 years. We get more innovative, we get more sustainable markets, things like that. When I started as a PhD student in this area at the turn of the millennium, 17 years ago, the death of distance, it was sort of the buzzword. We would no longer have to travel. We would no longer have to live in these dense cities that can be very crowded, expensive, and polluted, because we don't have to see each other anymore because we can communicate. The death of distance. And there was at least in some sectors and in research, people who wanted to believe this, we would no longer have to solve problems with this because we could just communicate and people stopped traveling. This didn't happen, and I'm not surprised, and a lot of people are not surprised. On the other hand, what we are seeing that the people who are living dense in urban cities, people who are traveling longer distances, they are also the ones who use non-physical communication more. So there does not seem to be a substitution effect. And it seems to be we have just the wonderful skill, we humans, to communicate difficult and complex discussions and topics when we are in the same room, when we communicate in 3 dimensions, rather than just talking over with some other kind of technology. But, so, this is a good thing. We try to, we should not try to stop these trends. I think it's important for our welfare, but obviously we will have problems. And this is what the transport economist is dealing with every day, all kind of problem. How do we keep accessibility, people, markets coming closer to each other without or trying to reduce problems with congestion, emissions, global carbon emissions, and local more pollutants that are damaging for our health, and these huge costs that are spent on transport infrastructure, and also for all the travelers spending a lot of money on this. So how do we keep the welfare but trying to deal with these problems that are only getting worse? And to do that, we have to try and, so how can we break this link between more car travel, more of these bad things, and more accessibility? And to do that, we need to understand what drives car use. What is the drivers, and can we sort of reduce it without causing problems or reducing accessibility? Obviously, we also need to understand what drives bicycle use, what drives public transport use, all these things to understand the competition. But now, I think I'll spend the rest of this time here today to talk about drivers of car use. Around 10 years ago, there were people in, oh, this is not 10 years ago, but around 10 years ago, there was this observation or notion, okay, the car use is starting to decline. And this is the number of vehicles traveled per person in a number of countries in Western Europe and the Western world, United States and Australia as well. And you see here from the, well, you can see post-war period and up to about the turn of the millennium, we had a constant increase in car use. And we explain this by we getting richer, people get more car, and things like that. But something happened here then, and it started to decline. And then there was a lot of people say, okay, this is because people are changing preferences, because young people don't want to drive anymore. And what we had previously in transport assumed that what drives car use is fuel prices, oil prices, and GDP growth, income growth. But here something happened that couldn't be explained by that. So this is a shift in attitudes and also the assumption that hereafter this trend will sort of continue down. So we've dealt with lots of this problem. Great. There was even, I mean, in Swedish media, people saying, so we should stop building roads because people will not drive anymore in the future. But then it's a little weird, actually, that this seemed to have occurred at the same time. It's a same point in time in all these countries where car use is so massively different. A number of cars per capita is also very different in these countries. So what would have happened at the same point in time? If it's a shift of preferences, that usually takes a long time. And obviously this is important to understand. If this is really going down, then we don't have to deal with the policies. It will just keep declining anyway. So this is a study, and we took data from all these countries that I showed you, basically. And this is, I show you the United States here. This is the vehicle miles traveled per capita, this one. And then we plotted it against the GDP per capita, the green line, and the gas price here. And then we try to see whether we could just leave these preference shifts. We say that we don't believe that we don't have to assume that people are changing preferences. We only try to explain it with these two variables. And we do the same thing in all these countries. And then we find, actually, that with a very simple model that assumes that the vehicle miles traveled per capita is a function of only the GDP per capita, income growth, and gasoline prices, we can predict both the increase and the decline. And we found this around 2012, starting saying that this decline is not shifted. We don't have to assume that people have shifting preferences. We only have to assume this is the gasoline prices. The oil prices increased earlier here, but the gasoline prices is shifting. So, and we see, so when the economic downturn is starting to vanish, and we'll have we are in a, we start to have income growth again, and when gasoline prices are declining, which they have been, we will see people start driving more, and this also happened in all these countries. So, whoop. Shit. But, okay, we can't say that people aren't changing preferences, but we don't have to assume that they do. But here comes more interesting stuff. And as I said, we can do this for all these countries. The only country that behaves a little bit differently is Germany, because they always drive more and more and more, no matter what's happening. This is the curve for Sweden. And for Sweden, we had a little more detailed data, because we had data on what's happening in the cities and what is happening outside the cities. And with cities, I mean now the county of Stockholm, the city of Gothenburg, and the city of Malmö. Here's the gasoline price, this is the GDP per capita, and here is the vehicle miles traveled. And here you see that in the urban areas, they respond stronger to these increases in gas prices and the decline in GDP. So it's the travel car traveling is declining stronger, and people in the urban areas are more responsive. So, and this, with data from England, for instance, you see the same pattern, that the urban population and the rest of the country is starting to behave differently. So then you wonder, why is this? Well, obviously, we don't know why, but you can think people in the city, they have more options to swap. They are richer, but they have more option to swap transport mode. They can go by public transport, and more importantly, the distances in the city are shorter. So that means that they can also start to go by bike, which is very much more difficult outside the cities because of the longer distances. So that brings us to try and understand what drives the transport car travel in the city of Stockholm. And this is a graph showing from 98 the number of motor vehicles. This is public transport. It's growing at roughly the same pace as the population growth in the country. But the car use is pretty much stable here over a long period. And this is the inner city, and that's even slightly declining. This is where we had congestion charges. But it's pretty stable, whereas it's the public transport growth. So how can we explain this? Car use is increasing everywhere else, but not in the city, except that they are also more responsive. Well, one thing that seems to happening is that we are getting, the urbanization is increasing in Sweden, in Stockholm. And this, one way of seeing this is a share of all trips that are made in the county of Stockholm that go from the outside the congestion charging, from the inner city, from outside the inner city to the inner city and the other way. And that share of trips has been pretty stable, like 23%, up until this last decade, where it suddenly increased. So the inner city is becoming more popular. And this is for work, but it's also for leisure. People tend to like being in the inner city. And obviously then it's more difficult to drive because it's increasing congestion, increasing travel time. But it's also a sign that the city is accessible because it's becoming more popular. People can see each other when they work and when they don't work. Yeah, this is just to again underscore what I just showed, that this is number of car travel kilometers per person, and that is increasing mostly in rural areas, and it's actually decreasing in the cities. So it's a widening gap here between the cities and the areas outside the cities, where the city population are reducing their car use, where it's increasing in the rural parts of Sweden. So, as the inner city become more popular, we also see a shift in travel modes. This is the inner city trips. This is cities to and from the inner city, and this is trips between north and south. And we see here, this was really, really bad coloring, but you see that it should be cycling trips. Here in the inner city and to and from the inner city, cycling is increasing massively. There should be another bar here, I'm sorry for that. No, it shouldn't. It's walking and cycling. It's increasing. Car use is decreasing a lot, and public transport is pretty stable. Same thing is happening to and from the inner city. People are increasing their using bicycling a lot. And I can tell you this is more men, and it's preferably men with pretty high incomes. So this is a particular socioeconomic group that start to cycle much more. They're driving less, and public transport is pretty stable to and from the inner city. Whereas longer distances, people are not cycling, but they're increasing their share of public transport. And this is rich people. It's rich people that are shifting from car use. which you remember I said in the beginning, it's income and it's fuel prices that drives car use. That does not seem to be the case in the cities, because it's primarily rich men who is declining in their car use. So it's probably not something to do with income, but it's something to do with increasing travel times in the city with car. So they swap transport mode. So that's a different story. So if I try to summarize what drives car use and why is it slowing down in the inner cities, in Stockholm, London, Paris, Berlin, not Berlin, possibly, it's high density. People tend to go and be attracted to the inner city. And in the inner city, car accessibility is low compared to other travel modes. So it's more accessible with bicycle and public transport. Distances are also shorter, so people can actually cycle. So congesting. We also have obviously we have spent a lot of money in public transport, so that's one thing. And also as I said, shorter distances for slow modes, so that these travel modes are competing with car. So this obviously is what we wanted. We wanted to reduce car use, but also preserve a high density, preserve a high accessibility. So one solution to trying to breaking the trends, obviously, between increasing car use and accessibility is to increase densities around the world. So that's urbanization. And that's obviously a different, this is politically sensitive in Sweden and many other countries, where you see all this is, whole nation should live and people should live in the rural areas. If that's the case, we probably have to live with they are driving a lot. So it's very difficult to reduce car use if that is the policy. And I'll finish with one. Now I have sort of been arguing for higher density. And there's one more thing that I think we've just seen with higher densities, and that has to do with gender equality. So in all countries in the world that I know of, there is a pretty large difference in the commuting distances between men and women. And generally you can say that the more gender equal a country is, measured in terms of representation of women and violence against women and incomes and so on, the larger gender equality, the larger is the differences in commuting distances. That's a sort of good indicator of the gender equality. And this is the differences in commuting distance. I should say first, on the national level, we have a pretty large difference between men and women, and this gap is not even reducing. It's still there. But this is people in Stockholm, and this is commuting distances. And this is men and women, and it's 2004 and 2015. And what you see here, that women and men, or people working or living in the inner city, the gender gap has closed. So men and women are behaving much more similar. Whereas if you go out, these are people living further in the outer suburbs of Sweden, and also more similar to people living in rest of Sweden. You see the gender gap is pretty large, and it's actually closing, but it's still there. In rest of Sweden, it's not even closing. So whether this is a sorting effect or whether there is actually something in the higher density that are promoting gender equality, there remains to be seen. It's further research, but it's an interesting observation that has been spotted also in other cities like San Francisco and Toronto. So maybe it's just that women are more sensitive to commuting distance. So, conclusion. Car use is sensitive to economic growth and driving costs. So if you want to reduce car use on a national or a global level, these driving costs is what you have to start to deal with, because people will respond to that. We know that for sure from the recession 10 years ago. But also density, increased density will always also reduce car use. And that has the benefit that it also does not reduce accessibility. So that is better for economic growth, also gender equality. People become more gender equal. Thank you.